Hey good people, this is Nell once again from the Overclock magazine. So, in the last 4 videos or so, maybe a bit more, I've been looking at these mid-range offerings from both AMD and Nvidia. These GPUs were definitely not well received in general. Perhaps more so from Nvidia than AMD, and the reason for that I believe is not entirely due to the performance of the GPUs themselves, but rather the anemic 8GB of memory on some models. Simply put, the 8GB of VRAM is hurting performance on these GPUs, and if you put that together with the higher prices than what was expected, you end up with the lukewarm reception that these cards actually got. Okay, so with all that being said, I'm here with yet another Radeon RX 9060 XT, but this time it's the 16GB model from Gigabyte. In fact, this is the gaming OC model that is visually identical to the GeForce RTX 5060 Ti 16GB I reviewed just this last video, to the point where it's hard to actually tell which GPU is which. As a result of this, I'm not going to go over what this card looks like, features, etc. It's damn near identical to the previous GPU, barring the 3 display outputs as opposed to 4. Outside of these cards are identical. What isn't the same, however, is price. And as it stands, the Gigabyte Radeon RX 9060 XT gaming OC is just $8,799 at Woodware or $390 from Amazon, which becomes $472 USD with shipping and duties. This price alone means, compared to the GeForce equivalent, it's the same price as the 8GB GeForce RTX 5060 Ti and about 3,000 Rand or $172 cheaper than the 16GB model of the 5060 Ti. This alone means the 9060 XT is amongst the best bang for buck GPUs money can buy in SA, and in fact, this model makes it almost pointless to look at what Nvidia has in the price range. In fact, the most affordable 16GB 5060 Ti I could find is over 1,000 Rand more expensive than this Radeon card, and it's the most basic, most entry-level version of the 5060 Ti I have ever seen. Now that we have all that context, let's not waste any more time and actually look at the performance of this card. Before that, however, I have to say I didn't have much luck with overclocking on this GPU. In fact, I couldn't get much overclocking done at all, in particular for the memory, which would not budge at all. I think the most I got was just under 2650 MHz or so, which is nothing alarming given that the default frequency is 2518. On the GPU core side of things were not much better at all, and I ended up resorting to auto overclock, which added about 105 MHz to the core. And for sure, your particular sample will definitely overclock better than the one that I had. That being said, testing was done on the AMD Ryzen 9 9900X, the ROG Crosshair X870E Apex, Corsair's Vengeance DDR5 memory, all of which was powered by the Corsair HX 1500i and cooled by the Corsair Titan RX 360mm AIO. First up, we have Clear Obscure Expedition 33. Now, I know Unreal Engine 5 games are getting a lot of heat, but truth be told, some games much like this one actually run very well. So I don't think it's an engine thing, but a more developer thing. Either way, just look at the differences between the 16GB Radeon card and this 8GB counterpart. The Gigabyte 16GB card is offering exactly double the performance. The 1% loads are also improved dramatically, just showing how detrimental to performance 8GB of memory is. We then move on to Marvel's Spider-Man 2. Once again, the 16GB Radeon RX 9060 XT delivers 49% more performance on average, while the 1% lows make a 40% improvement over the 8GB card. In Alan Wake 2, the difference between the 8GB 9060 XT and the 16GB model isn't as large as when we were looking at the other games before. However, if you look at the 1% lows, they actually illustrate how unpleasant the experience is on 8GB cards, with frame rates more than halving sometimes. Average frame rates don't show it, but the 1% lows tell the real story here. In Dragon Age the Veilguard, the gap between the 8GB and 16GB Radeon card isn't as large, but then again, the GPU itself seems to be struggling here, unlike on the 5060 Ti. As such, the 16GB 9060 XT appears rather slow in this game, or at least slow compared to the 5060 Ti. In F1 2024, the 16GB Radeon RX 9060 XT once again comes out ahead of the 8GB model. This is mostly due to the 1% lows, but I would say both are more than playable. However, I'd rather play on the 16GB card with 28% better lows. In Cyberpunk, I had expected the 16GB card to pull ahead by some margin, as that had been the case with the 16GB 5060 Ti versus the 8GB card. However, this was not the case. There's hardly any difference between the 8GB and 16GB model, and performance here is pure GPU or memory bandwidth limited. In Forza Horizon 5, a game where I did not expect any difference, I captured the same surprising result. 1% loads of 98 frames per second are great, and so is 122 FPS average. However, with more memory, the performance jumped by roughly 21% in both 1% loads and the average frame rate. That being said, I'd personally have a tough time telling the difference between the two when playing at this resolution. And then finally, we have Hitman World of Assassination. Average frame rates show that there's not much between the 8GB and the 16GB Radeon cards, but the 1% loads are again showing that the 16GB card is doing a lot better, holding above 30 FPS. The difference here has to come down to memory once again, as all other things are exactly the same. Lastly, let's look at the synthetic benchmarks. In superposition, the Radeon cards deliver roughly identical performance, so there's nothing between them, and this is largely true for 3D Mark tests as well. Yes, the 16GB card is consistently faster, but is by a smaller margin than what you saw in the gaming tests. Anyway, that's that for the performance of the Gigabyte Radeon RX 9060 XT Gaming OC 16GB. Again, this card is near identical to the GeForce version, so if you found that design appealing or not, you are likely to have the same sentiment here as well. I will say, however, the temperatures were exceptionally good, and I think at some point I never got over 60 degrees while gaming, which is, I think, very, very, very good. Against the 16GB 5060 Ti, I'm partial to the 5060 Ti because of the entire NVIDIA ecosystem, the number of games that support DLSS and so forth. However, from a pure performance per dollar, performance per rand perspective, the Radeon cards are significantly better. At least the Radeon 9060 XT 16GB card at the current price is better than what NVIDIA is offering, regardless of the model. Either way, that's it from me and the Gigabyte Radeon RX 9060 XT Gaming OC. Until the next time, do take great care of yourselves, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Take care and peace.